30 minutes into labor, you already know something is wrong. It is roughly 10,000 years ago, somewhere on a grass plain that does not have a name yet. You are squatting, holding a leather strap looped over a low branch, and the woman beside you, the one who has done this 6 times before, presses both hands flat against your back and tells you to breathe through it. The fire nearby smells like wet wood and scorched fat from whatever was cooking before everyone dropped what they were doing to come find you. There is no clock. There is no hospital. There is a fire. A handful of women who showed up the moment they heard you cry out, and roughly a 1 in 8 chance, by some modern estimates, that you do not survive what happens in the next few hours. Pause on that number for a second. 1 in 8, not 1 in 8,000. 1 in 8 for most of human history. Giving birth was, by a wide margin, one of the most dangerous things a person could choose to do with their own body. Almost every person who has ever lived exists because someone, somewhere, beat those odds. So here is the actual question worth asking. Without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without a single sterile instrument anywhere on the planet, how did ancient humans survive childbirth at all? The answer involves painted bricks, a secret instrument locked inside a wooden box, a Roman law about dead mothers, and roughly 6,000 years of women quietly keeping each other alive, while history mostly forgot to write it down. Most people picture ancient childbirth as something almost mythic. A woman squatting alone behind a tree, calmly delivering a baby in 20 minutes, then walking back to camp like nothing happened. That image shows up constantly in documentaries, in casual conversation, even in some older anthropology textbooks. It is wrong. Almost completely wrong. The earlier assumption was that childbirth only became genuinely dangerous once humans started giving birth lying down in hospitals, surrounded by interventions that supposedly made things worse instead of better. The real picture is closer to the opposite. Human childbirth has been mechanically difficult since long before any hospital existed, for a reason built directly into our skeletons. Humans walk upright on 2 legs, which narrowed the pelvis over millions of years of evolution. At the same time, human brains, and therefore human infant skulls, kept getting larger. Those 2 evolutionary pressures point in opposite directions, and human anatomy has never fully resolved the conflict. Researchers call this tension the obstetrical dilemma. It means a healthy human baby's head is, in a very literal physical sense, almost too large for the space it has to pass through. No other birth in the animal kingdom requires quite this kind of contortion. So before any culture, any ritual, any medicine enters the picture at all, the basic mechanics of human birth were already working against the people attempting it. Let's start with something basic about why this happens in the first place. Picture trying to push a soccer ball through a doorway, slightly narrower than the ball itself. A doorway that also has to stay structurally intact afterward, because you will need it again tomorrow to walk, run, and carry water. That is roughly the engineering problem human pelvic anatomy solves every single time a baby is born. Fossil pelvises, including a roughly 1.2 million-year-old specimen found at Gona, in Ethiopia, confirm this tight squeeze stretches back to some of the earliest members of our genus. Unlike almost every other primate, a human baby cannot simply travel straight through the birth canal facing one direction. The canal changes shape and width at different points, forcing the baby to rotate as it descends, sometimes more than once. A chimpanzee giving birth can typically do it alone, facing forward, often within an hour, because the path is wider relative to the infant's head. That rotation is also why human infants are typically born facing away from the mother, the opposite of what most other primate mothers experience. It sounds like a small mechanical detail. It has a massive consequence. A mother giving birth facing away from her own baby cannot easily reach down or guide the delivery, in a way other primate mothers can. Some researchers argue this single anatomical quirk may be the actual root of why human childbirth became a social event instead of a solitary one. So let's get back to that fire and the women gathered around it. In the 1980s, anthropologist Wenda Trevathan studied birth practices across a wide range of documented human societies and noticed something almost every other primate does not share. Humans almost never give birth completely alone. Chimpanzees do. Gorillas do. Most primate mothers retreat, deliver in private, and rejoin the group afterward. Humans, across an enormous range of cultures with no shared contact, consistently seek out another person during labor. Trevathan called this the obligate midwifery hypothesis, the idea that human childbirth may have evolved to require assistance, not simply as a cultural preference, but as something closer to a biological necessity. Given everything we just covered about rotation and anatomy, this pattern shows up in foraging societies with almost no material technology at all, alongside societies with elaborate medical traditions. Different continents, different centuries, different languages, same basic behavior. Someone shows up every single time. That instinct to show up eventually left physical evidence behind, and one discovery in particular changed how researchers understood ancient obstetrics. In 2001, archaeologists excavating a site at South Abydos in Egypt uncovered a painted mud brick dated to roughly 1700 BCE. On its surface, a woman is shown squatting, attended by other women, in the middle of giving birth. It was the first physical confirmation of something ancient Egyptian medical texts had described for centuries, but nobody had ever actually found. A birth brick. Women were believed to crouch on a pair of these bricks during labor, using them as a stable, raised platform. The discovery lines up with an even older document, the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dated to around 1800 BCE, widely considered the oldest surviving medical text dealing specifically with women's health. It contains diagnostic notes, prognosis statements, and treatment suggestions for complications during pregnancy and birth, written with a clinical bluntness that feels startlingly modern. This was not guesswork passed down as folklore. This was an early medical system, attempting, in writing, to standardize how birth was managed. Not every culture told the same version of this story. In parts of Edo period Japan, roughly the 1600s through the 1800s, childbirth was considered ritually impure, and women in some regions gave birth in a small, separate structure called an ubuya, set apart from the main household. On the surface, that looks like a direct contradiction of the obligate midwifery pattern. Look closer, and the contradiction softens. Even inside an ubuya, an experienced attendant was still typically present, just not the wider gathering of relatives and neighbors common elsewhere. The isolation was social and spiritual, separating the birth from the household's everyday space, not a genuine abandonment of the laboring woman herself. The human need for assistance during birth was never a single uniform ritual repeated identically across every culture on Earth. It was a flexible pressure, expressed differently depending on what each culture believed about purity and danger, while still, in nearly every documented case, keeping at least one experienced person within reach. Ancient birthing positions were rarely the flat, lying down position most people now assume is simply how childbirth works. Cross-cultural surveys of pre-industrial societies have found that upright positions, squatting, kneeling, crouching on a birthing stool, were overwhelmingly the norm across most documented cultures, not the exception. There is a real mechanical reason for this. Gravity assists the descent. An upright pelvis can shift and widen slightly more than one locked flat on a bed. The now familiar image of a woman lying on her back for delivery became dominant in parts of Europe considerably later, tied less to medical evidence and more to the convenience of physicians attending births in a clinical setting. We do not have a fully confirmed account of exactly when or why that shift happened everywhere. It did. And competing explanations exist in the historical literature. What is confirmed is the direction of travel. Humanity spent thousands of years giving birth upright. Then it spent a few centuries giving birth lying down. Only recently has that default started shifting back, informed partly by exactly the kind of archaeological evidence sitting in that Egyptian birth brick. Physicians and attendants could only do so much when labor genuinely went wrong, and for centuries, almost nothing existed to physically intervene in an obstructed birth. That changed quietly in the early 1600s, with a family of French Huguenot surgeons living in England named Chamberlain. Peter Chamberlain the Elder is generally credited with inventing the obstetric forceps, a curved metal instrument capable of safely gripping and guiding a baby's head through a difficult delivery. It should have transformed obstetrics across Europe almost immediately. It did not. The Chamberlain family kept the design a closely guarded secret for multiple generations, reportedly carrying the instrument into birthing rooms inside a large locked wooden box, sometimes blindfolding the laboring woman and clearing the room of witnesses before using it, to prevent anyone from learning how it worked. Picture that scene for a second. A family arrives at a desperate household, sends everyone else out, covers the mother's eyes so she cannot describe what she saw, and works in near silence behind a closed door, protecting a piece of metal worth more to them than the lives it could have saved elsewhere. For roughly a century, a tool that could have saved an unknown number of mothers and infants existed almost exclusively within one profit-protecting family. The forceps eventually became public knowledge in the 1700s. By then, Generations of women in obstructed labor had died without access to a solution that already existed, sitting locked inside a box in a stranger's traveling bag. Knowledge alone was not always written on papyrus or carved into legal codes. Most of it lived in plant matter, passed from one set of hands to another, generation after generation, with no paper trail at all, across wildly different regions. From the Andes to West Africa to the river valleys of ancient China, healers and midwives independently identified specific plants capable of speeding a stalled labor, easing pain, or slowing dangerous bleeding after delivery. Ergot, a fungus growing on rye grain, was used in parts of medieval Europe to trigger contractions, a genuinely effective compound that was also dangerously easy to overdose, capable of cutting off blood flow to a limb if misjudged. Raspberry leaf, used across multiple unconnected traditions, is still studied today for its mild effect on uterine muscle tone. None of this knowledge came from a laboratory. It came from generations of careful, dangerous trial and error, the kind where a wrong guess could cost a life, and a right one got remembered, retested, and passed down by word of mouth for centuries before anyone wrote a word of it down. Modern pharmacology has since confirmed that a meaningful number of these traditional remedies contain compounds doing exactly what generations of midwives believed they did, which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone tempted to dismiss this as primitive superstition. How many of these solutions were actually evidence-based? Centuries before anyone had a word for evidence-based medicine, spiritual protection ran alongside the physical kind, and ancient Egypt offers one of the clearest examples. Two specific deities, Bes and Taweret, were associated almost exclusively with protecting women through pregnancy and labor. Bes, a dwarf god with a lion-like face, was considered fierce enough to frighten away anything dangerous lurking near a birthing room. Taweret, depicted as part hippopotamus, part crocodile, part lion, stood guard specifically over the moment of delivery itself. Amulets carved in their likeness have been found in burial sites across Egypt, worn by women specifically during pregnancy, suggesting these were not abstract religious symbols, but objects carried into the actual room where labor happened. It would be easy to dismiss this as primitive superstition layered on top of the real medicine. That framing misses something important. In a situation where roughly 1 in 8 women faced a genuine chance of dying, where pain relief barely existed and outcomes were often impossible to predict, a fierce protective figure standing guard at the door may have done something measurable after all. It steadied the people in the room. Fear and tension can slow labor and worsen outcomes even today, something modern obstetric research has confirmed. A culture that surrounded its most dangerous biological event with deliberate calm, ritual, and a sense of protection was not being irrational. It was managing the one variable available to manage, long before anyone understood the physiology behind why it worked. The cost of getting any of this wrong is not abstract, and it is not only recorded in old papyrus scrolls. It is recorded in bone. Archaeologists have documented multiple ancient burials across different continents showing the skeletal remains of a fetus still positioned within or near the mother's pelvis, physical evidence of an obstructed labor that ended in the death of both. These are not common finds, because skeletal evidence this specific and well-preserved is rare. When researchers do find one, it functions almost like a frozen moment, a single failed attempt at exactly the survival story this entire video has been describing. Picture the gap between that burial and the painted Egyptian birth brick, showing a successful, attended delivery. Same biological event, two completely different outcomes separated by nothing more than luck, anatomy, and whoever happened to be standing in the room. Even once tools existed, the deadliest threat in childbirth turned out to be invisible, and it took disturbingly long for medicine to notice it. Well into the 1800s, maternity wards in major European hospitals recorded shockingly high death rates from something called childbed fever, a violent infection following delivery. At Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s, one maternity ward staffed by physicians and medical students had a death rate dramatically higher than a nearby ward staffed primarily by midwives. Women in that city reportedly begged to be admitted to the midwife-run ward instead, terrified of the one with better-trained doctors. A physician named Ignaz Semmelweis investigated the gap and noticed the doctors were moving directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies, without washing their hands in between. He introduced a chlorinated hand-washing protocol. Deaths in that ward dropped sharply, almost immediately. The medical establishment of the time largely rejected his findings, decades before germ theory was widely accepted, and Semmelweis died without ever seeing his idea adopted. Here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. How is it possible that a frightened, uneducated pregnant woman in 1840s Vienna, working purely off instinct and rumor, correctly identified which ward was more dangerous before the doctors running it figured out why? A traditional midwife in an ancient village, who had never touched a human corpse before attending a birth, may have unintentionally been safer for her patients than a university-trained physician walking straight out of an autopsy room and into a delivery. Progress, it turns out, is not always a straight line upward. There is one more piece of this story worth knowing, because it explains a phrase you have probably heard your whole life without ever questioning where it came from. The surgical delivery known today as a cesarean section is commonly believed to be named after Julius Caesar, supposedly born this way himself. Historians consider that origin story almost certainly false. Julius Caesar's mother is documented as having lived for decades after his birth, at a time when a mother essentially never survived this kind of surgery. A far more likely explanation traces the name to an old Roman legal requirement, sometimes called the lex caesarea, mandating that if a woman died very late in pregnancy, the child had to be cut from her body before burial in hopes of saving the infant. For most of recorded history, this procedure was performed almost exclusively after the mother had already died or was clearly beyond saving. A surgery we now think of as a routine, life-saving option for the mother was for thousands of years essentially the opposite. A last resort attempted only once survival for her was no longer the question being asked. Put the two numbers next to each other, and the scale of the change becomes almost hard to process. A lifetime risk near 1 in 8. The rough estimate some researchers attach to high mortality, pre-industrial populations, against a global maternal mortality rate that recent estimates place at roughly 200 deaths per 100,000 births in much of the world today, with far lower numbers still in countries with strong access to medical care. That gap did not close because human anatomy changed. The pelvis is the same shape it was 10,000 years ago. Every mechanical problem this video has described, the narrow canal, the rotation, the awkward angle a mother cannot see around, is still exactly as true today as it was for that woman by the fire. The gap closed because of antiseptic technique, blood transfusion, safe surgical delivery, and the accumulated hard-won knowledge of exactly the kind this video has been tracing, from a painted brick in Egypt to a locked box of forceps in England. Think about that. The next time someone mentions a hospital birth, like it is simply the obvious default way this has always worked. Painkillers, sterilized instruments, monitored heart rates, the option of a surgical delivery if labor genuinely goes wrong. All of that is recent, measured in decades, not millennia, compared to the roughly 200,000 years humans have been giving birth on this planet. The actual constant running underneath all of it, the obligate midwifery instinct identified back in the 1980s, has never really gone away. Modern hospitals, it turns out, are quietly catching up on something this whole video has been circling. Continuous supportive labor companionship is no longer a folk tradition researchers politely tolerate. Multiple clinical reviews, including a frequently cited Cochrane analysis pooling data from numerous trials, have found that women who receive continuous one-on-one support during labor experience measurably shorter labors, fewer surgical interventions, and report better outcomes overall than women who labor without that kind of presence. In other words, the instinct that sent women running toward a laboring neighbor's tent 10,000 years ago is the exact same mechanism modern hospitals are now formally rebuilding under a different name with a research budget attached. Walk into almost any modern delivery room, and you will still find exactly what that fire 10,000 years ago had. Someone showing up, a partner, a nurse, a doula, a friend holding a hand that does not want to be empty, not because tradition demands it, but because the body and the nervous system genuinely respond to it. The bricks changed. The forceps changed. The fierce little statue of bees guarding the doorway is long gone. The instinct underneath all of it did not. We answered how ancient humans survived childbirth often enough to keep the species going. The harder question is how many did not, and how much of that gap between survival and loss came down to nothing more than which century, which country, or which family happened to be guarding the right piece of locked-away knowledge at the time. Somewhere, right now, in a hospital room, or a home, or somewhere that has no name yet either, a woman is breathing through a contraction with someone's hand pressed flat against her back. The same way that woman by the fire 10,000 years ago once had someone's hand pressed against hers. The smell of wood smoke is gone. The bricks are gone. The fire itself is gone. The hand is still there. That hand is really the whole story. If stories like this one stay with you, subscribe. The women who figured this out through trial, loss, and sheer stubborn persistence rarely got their names written down anywhere. The least we can do now is keep asking what else they knew, and who was standing beside them when they learned it.